Welcome to our first lecture, Clef and Note Names. We're going to start this by looking at a brief history of Western music notation, and I think you'll find this very interesting. This particular video is going to be a companion to the one that is also on Canvas by Howard Goodall, which is completely entertaining and gives you a real snapshot view of music notation from a different perspective. So let's look at some of these things. We can trace most of our music notation back to Babylon around 1400 BC. And so since the dawn of recorded history, humans have used symbols of graphic representation to illustrate the environment, animals, languages, ceremonies, deities, and music. Well, this happens to be traced to 1400 BC, and it's from ancient Babylon, like I said, which is present-day Iraq. And it consists of cuneiform characters, so characters that were drawn in on clay, and then this happened to survive, and it was copied by a professor in the 20th century, And here is a modern interpretation of what this probably could have sounded like. That's the beginning. There's the end of the first phrase. So it's very simple, and we're not sure about the rhythm. But the idea is that notation probably goes back as far as the notation of language, which we really tend to believe in the West anyway that we can trace to ancient Babylon and Sumeria. Then we can look at ancient Greece. I mean, this evolved for about 1,000 years, and you can begin to see that people were writing things down. They were recording their culture. And so this is the most famous of the ancient pieces that we have. It's called the Epitaph to Psychelos, and the English translation is here, and I have written a modern notation of the melody, and then you get to hear this sung in a facsimile of how it could have sounded back in ancient Greece. And it was written on a marble stele, which is that particular figure you see right here, and then there was a tombstone inscription that also explained it. So it sounds like this. That's all we have time for right now, but this particular PowerPoint will be on Canvas, so you can listen to the whole piece. Very beautiful, and it sets up the contours, the ups and downs, the rises and falls, and the rhythmic constructs that have become pretty much the progenitor of all Western music. Then when we move up rather quickly to the Middle Ages, we find something really interesting. Of course, the Middle Ages is 1,000 years roughly, from 476 AD to 1453, in about 3 divisions, early, middle, and late. But the literature and music notation had 4 major influences. The Roman Catholic influence in Italy, the Byzantine in Constantinople, and the Visigoth in Spain, and the North African Moorish influence, or the Muslim influence. Well, if you look at the map, you can see the main cities in the Middle Ages. And of course, it gives you dates, and these are middle to late Middle Ages, but they correspond to some very important areas that we'll be talking about. Constantinople, of course, is in now present-day Turkey, right down here on the Bosphorus, the Strait of the Bosphorus. And it was very important because of Constantine. And all of these particular cultures influenced each other at one time or another in the Middle Ages. But the early beginnings in Europe we can kind of trace back to a music scholar and theorist, Isidore of Seville. And he was writing in the early 7th century and remarked that it was impossible to notate music. Now, it was really interesting. He became a saint in the church, and he was famous at a time of crazy disintegration of classical culture and aristocratic violence and illiteracy, because he was well educated, and he was involved in the conversion of the Arian Visigothic kings to Catholicism. So it's the spread of Catholicism in Spain, in that particular area. And his fame on the church was based on his Etymologiae, or the Etymological Encyclopedia, which he assembled, which were extracts from many books from classical antiquity that might have otherwise been lost. But I thought it was interesting that he said, it can't be notated. Well, here we are. The first style of music that we would listen to in music history, for Western music history that is the chant. And by the middle of the 9th century, this notation began to develop around the singing of chants in monasteries in Europe. So the Gregorian chant, as it's sometimes called, it actually wasn't collected by Pope Gregory, but that stuck, is one of the earliest symbols used. It's called neumes, and it's the earliest surviving musical notation of this type. And we found it in the Musica Disciplina of Aurelian of Rouen from about 850. Now, Rouen is this little dot on the map. It's in Burgundy, wine country and very important medieval kingdom and duce of the Middle Ages. But the monastery is still with us. Of course, it's been remodeled many times. But the sound of chant is this. Now, what I want you to notice about that is that there is an echo. And these chants were sung in cathedrals. They were learned and practiced in the monasteries. But in cathedrals, the way the walls were constructed, there was a natural echo. And if you've ever been in a large cathedral, you know that there's a tremendous echo. In some places, a 2-3 second delay. And so this created a sound that was very different from the sound that was in the public square, that was in festivals. And it was considered highly sacred. And when we study more about music history, we'll go into greater depth with this. But that's the first sound that we want to think of. But people said, well, how do we notate this? And so it began to be notated by two groups of people, the Goths and the Romans. Now, the Goths are members of a Germanic people that invaded the Roman Empire from the east, right around the 3rd to 5th centuries, that helped usher in the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of what we think of as the Middle Ages. And the Eastern Division, the Ostrogoths, founded a kingdom in Italy. You can see that in orange. While the Visigoths went on to found one in Spain. Now, the only reason we bring this up is these two contributions, the Goths, the northern tribes in Europe, related to Celts and others. created something called the Mozarabic chant, also known as Hispanic chant or Old Hispanic chant, Old Spanish chant, or Visigothic chant. And then the Romans, the Ostrogoths, with the influence from the East and from the Roman tradition, the Catholic Church and the monastery system of the Middle Ages created the Gregorian chant that we just listened to. But listen how similar this Mozarabic chant is, and it has what's known as a call and response. So the cantor will sing a little bit, and then you'll hear an amen. That call and response is ancient and largely had African origins as far as we can tell in the history of world music. So it's interesting that that influences the shape and the form of the chant. Well, all of this needed to be written down, and so we have some bonus information here. The ancestors of modern symbolic music and the notation originated in the Roman Catholic Church, as monks developed methods to put plain chant, the sacred songs, to parchment. Now, that was because they had to memorize 365 days of different music for each day, sometimes 3 and 4 and 5 different services a day. And so the earliest of these ancestral systems from the 8th century didn't really utilize a staff. It used a neum or a pneuma, a symbol of dots and strokes that were placed above the text. Now, even though the text was there was no way we could read it and say that's what it sounded like necessarily, because they weren't really capable of expressing considerable musical complexity. They could not exactly express pitch or tune, but it served mainly as a reminder of things they had already memorized over several decades, really. So it was a memory trigger. Well, notation today still is, but it's more advanced. So the early music notation to issue an exact pitch started with something that had a single horizontal red line. If you look in this picture, you'll see that red line. And all of the neumes were put above and below that. So the red line was like a starting pitch, and all the other neumes were relative above or below that starting pitch. And so the vertical positions of each one of them indicate which pitch or pitches it represents. So although the 4 line staffs remained in use until the present day for plain chant, other types of music have been used in various times. And we have a modern 5 line staff that was adopted in France and became almost universal by the 16th century. And now there's the famous person that you're going to hear about in the Howard Goodall's Big Bang about music. It's fantastic, the Big Bang 1 on notation. And Guido of Arezzo, an Italian and wonderful innovator. He created a system of notation that evolved in France by the 16th century. The 5-line 4-page system was adopted largely due to the innovations of this man, Guido. He created a system of assigning pitches to different parts of the hand as a mnemonic device to assist singers. And we sing do, re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, la, sol, fa, re, do. Originally it was ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, Sunday, which is really interesting. It had to do with this particular Ut Queant Laxis, hymn to St. John the Baptist. So this is just a fantastic innovation. And guess what? There is the beginning of modern Western music. Now, Howard Goodell goes into great detail about this and takes us on a tour of that area, and it's fun. He is a fabulous presenter. So the neumes and relative pitch positions became very, very important, and presumably these were intended for mnemonic, like I mentioned before, a way of remembering something they already knew. But as it evolved, thanks to Guido, we have something that is really, really cool. So here's Ut Queant Laxis. Listen to the te, que, re, mi, fa, sol, la, sang, te, ich. Listen.
Ut queant laxis resonare fibris mira gestorum famolituorum solve potuti labire atum sante
You can just imagine as they were learning this piece or remembering it or singing it, they knew which neume corresponded with what finger and what part of the hand. And that brings us to the present system, the 5-line staff. And this system of notation used today incorporates the 5 lines 4 space system. The lines and spaces are collectively known as the musical staff or simply staff. Sometimes when they're plural, they're staves. Now, what's so interesting about it is that we have something left over from the Middle Ages, and that's clef signs. So included on the staff are clef signs that indicate the relative position of high and low pitches. A clef, and the French word for clef is key, is a musical symbol used to indicate the pitch of written notes. So it's placed on one of the lines at the beginning of the staff. The clef sign indicates a specific note from which all the other pitches are derived. And we only use A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, the first 7 letters of the Arabic alphabet, to indicate those pitches. And then they repeat as we go up in octaves or down in octaves. So this line serves as a reference point for which all the names of the other notes can be determined. So the 4 types of clefs we use in modern notation are the G clef, that's the treble clef. So that particular picture you see here, the note G is on the G line. The alto clef is called the C clef, and the note C is right on that middle line. And you see the 2 swirlies at the beginning of that clef. They surround that line C. There's a C tenor clef, which is very, very similar. And it just means that the middle C, as we would call it on the piano, starts on that 4th line. And then bass clef starts, the little 2 dots around the bass clef line is for F. So they're shown on that particular staff. And you'll be using mostly treble and bass clef. We will touch on alto clef occasionally, but you have to know how to write that and understand it. Clef shape and placement is rather interesting. The clefs indicate by their shape and placement on the staff a specific starting place for the names of the lines and spaces, as I mentioned earlier. And they're all named for the alphabetical order A through G. These 7 note names indicate the names of the lines and spaces, the adjacent lines and spaces, and the corresponding notes are written on the staff. I know that most of you understand this already, but it's really good to organize this and know the why and how. So the positions are explained here. The swirl of the treble clef surrounds G, and we call it G4 on the piano. It's the 4th G from the left side of the piano coming all the way to the top. And you can read this paragraph at your leisure, but the order of the notes remains consistent throughout the staff. for all of these clefs. This kind of just gives you a really good idea of that. Now you have to know cold treble and bass clef because we'll be doing chorales in 4 parts. So this is where you can use your Tenuto app if you're not really familiar with either clef to practice that. And we'll do some exercises with that in class. So the names of the pitches are based on the piano. So the current convention is to name pitches for their relative positions on the 88 keys, as you can see on this drawing. The lowest note on most pianos is A at 27.5 hertz. That means vibrations per second, 27.5 thousand vibrations, and it's called A0. The black key that is adjacent to the right is called A0 sharp. A0 sharp is slightly faster vibration per second, which gives us the little higher pitch. And this just continues all the way up. And it's a logarithmic system, not an arithmetic system. And as the notes get higher, they actually get closer together acoustically. So the diagram below, it says below, but it's actually to the right, shows all the pitches on the modern piano and their corresponding numbers and frequencies. And all are calculated from the middle, A4, which is 440 hertz. We call it therefore A440. Piano's tuned from that note. In England, they tune it to 441. All the pitches are slightly higher in England. Because the pitches continue beyond the scope of the written 5 lines of 4 spaces, we add small lines called ledger lines. Now, this goes back to the Middle Ages and early numismatic notation. So you can see that you just create the ledger line as a space holder so that your eye can see that really, really clearly. And so that helps us extend below and above the given staff. And the origin of the term ledger is kind of interesting. In medieval times, a ledger was a horizontal bar. Like in a fence, and used to support, as in a scaffolding or a fence. The word in Middle English was légère or légère, a large breviary beam, probably from layan or legan, to lay. It was first used in 1588, which is kind of cool. So it kind of resembles that. Here's the vertical pitch axis, and we have the ledgers right on that. Accountants use the term ledger for the same idea of having lines and spaces originally in before the computer days of being an accountant. Then the last real important thing is pitch and pitch class. This is pretty simple. Musical sounds are classified into 2 types, the pitch and the pitch class. The term pitch, when used in a theoretical context, refers to the same and specific frequency or piano key number of a single note. So like A440 or C4 or middle C. And so here are the names of those pitches, something we already pretty well know. And this is given in relation to all the others. And you'll notice the number after each one of them. That's the keyboard orientation of those notes. Pitch class refers to the group of all the possible theoretical pitches of one pitch, or number of one pitch. Like, look at all the C's. That's called a pitch class of all the possible C's. And of course, there are extremes in this set that are out of our hearing range, or they're very impractical to reproduce. So if I speak of a pitch class, I mean all possible B flats. If I speak of a certain B flat, it might be B flat 5. And then intervals are very important. That's the distance between 2 musical tones. And in the next lecture, we'll explore intervals and their possible combinations. That is the secret to music theory. If you understand intervals and their inversions, you've got it. It's the key to the entire process. So preliminarily, let's examine whole tones and semitones, or half and whole steps. That's the term we'll use, the more colloquial version of it. So the piano keyboard's a great physical representation of these 2 intervals. A half step, also called a semitone, is the distance on a piano between any two adjacent keys, regardless of color. So if you go white, like on E to F, there's no key between them, that's a half step. F to G, there happens to be a key between them, that's that black key. So F to G is a whole step. But F to the next black key above it, which could be called F sharp or G flat, it has two names, depending on how we decide to describe it in a key, that's a half step. So every other key on the piano, look at the back of the keyboard, every other key is a whole step. Every adjacent key is a half step. You really have to know that. And from that, that particular style of interval is how we create all of our key signatures. Well, that's it for this lecture. So be sure to watch the Howard Goodall video that's on the link, the YouTube video that's on the link on Canvas, and I'll see you in class.